All right, welcome everyone. We are so happy to see you join our conversation on defending democracy in the digital age. Digital age. I'm Ann Luther with the League of Women Voters of Maine. Together with the League of Women Voters of Alaska and Colorado, we produce this series. Over the last 20 some months, we have covered such topics as data privacy, combating extremism and propaganda online, the discriminatory effects of AI and algorithms, the elusiveness of regulations to defend elections and democracy, and election security and threats faced by state and local office holders. Today, we are thrilled to have Marietja Schaake join us. Marietja is the International Policy Director at Stanford University Cyber Policy Center and a global leader in tech regulations. She'll talk about her new book, The Tech Coup, How to Save Democracy from Silicon Valley. Under the cover of, quote, innovation, unquote, technology companies have successfully resisted regulation for decades and have begun to seize power from governments. Unregulated technology has become a forceful instrument for autocrats around the world, far from the utopian public square that was once promised by Silicon Valley leaders. That's terrible news for democracy and raises the stakes for the 2024 US presidential election, about which we are all probably feeling a little anxiety right now. So throughout the presentation tonight, please enter your questions in the chat. Marietja will take them once her opening remarks are finished. And so with that, let me now turn it over to Marietja. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Anne, and hello, everyone. It's great to see you. I'm very excited to see how many of the various aspects of technology and democracy you've already covered over the past sessions. So I hope that will mean that some of what I'm going to say will sound familiar or will have hooks to things you've heard before. But I also hope that there will be new things that will give you new insights. We've discussed before that I always love the interaction of these kinds of sessions because it will also allow me to meet you where you are with your questions and the agendas that you're trying to roll out. So I'm going to do a brief introduction and then I will be happy to take questions, and then I will fold in, somewhat longer answers to do part of the expose about what I think is important through that. But first of all, it's remarkable how the role of women and women's rights has suddenly become a top priority again, not for the right reasons. So I would not be surprised if women make up the decisive voters in the election in November. So it's great to see you all engaged and organized. And actually, and perhaps not coincidentally, in the field of studying technology and democracy, technology and human rights, technology and the rule of law, there are a remarkable amount of women. Scholars, experts who are at the forefront of this fight, which I think it is. It's another frontier of where our liberties, our open society is at stake. And I have chosen in the Tech Coup to really focus the analysis through the lens of power. You mentioned already disinformation, which is a hot topic. We've spoken about, foreign interference, cybersecurity, the integrity of election systems. These are all very important. But one of the risks that I saw is that there are so many incidents when it comes to our digital society. Another data breach on the front pages of our newspapers, another scandal with social media that impacts our youth or our elections for that matter, another foreign confrontation that has a digital component, and so on and so forth, that we are not connecting the dots. We risk not seeing the forest for the trees because there are so many incidents that it kind of blinds us to what is actually going on. And from my point of view, the real problem underlying so many of these incidents and so many of these subtopics of the challenge is that the private sector has too much power in the digital domain and that it's beginning to hurt democracy. So let me step back a little bit and tell you, what I've seen myself over the past 15 years or so, and how that connects with, research about what has happened in Silicon Valley, but also with the emergence of the global World Wide Web, the internet, and also in other parts of the world, because we're probably going to have a US-centric discussion tonight that is relevant, especially ahead of November. But there are also really important lessons that can be learned from other parts of the world, the EU that I know best as a jurisdiction, but also places like Kenya that I describe in the book that we might touch upon. So I was first elected as a member of the European Parliament at the age of 30, 15 years ago. And that was the time when Barack Obama, as a young senator, had just successfully used social media and data analysis for new ways of campaigning. And literally every progressive politician, at least, and probably every politician around the world wanted what he did, meaning they wanted to also engage younger people. They thought that using social media and data-driven campaigning was the coolest thing in the world, and that it was going to be a breakthrough in democracy. So that is a very important moment in time that happens to have coincided with when I was elected myself, but that has really shaped the thinking about the relationship between technology and democracy. At the time, you may recall, a lot of these companies that are now enormous monopolists, multi-billion-dollar companies, were actually much smaller. They were newcomers, and they were trying to disrupt the incumbents like publishers, incumbents like financial services, incumbents like the cab, the taxi industry, all sectors that had incumbents that were not necessarily popular and not necessarily treating, the journalists in the case of publishers, the cab drivers in the case of the taxi sector, the consumer in the case of banking, with sufficient respect. So it is actually understandable that these sectors were disrupted and that newcomers were going to try to challenge, to break through. The narrative at the time was also one of innovation. These innovative services were going to make life better, and they were going to lift up the unheard voices, unlock the information of the world, democratize people where that was necessary. And really, there was also the promise of emancipation, which I think is really important in the context of the role of women specifically. Now, I had just gotten elected, and because I was relatively young at the time, 30 years old, it was only natural that I would look at the role of technology as an emerging political theme because of the election of President Obama, but also because of developments that were happening in the Middle East at the time. Think about the Green Movement in Iran, think about the Arab Spring uprisings, where a youthful generation that we could directly be in touch with were asking for more justice, more freedom, an end to corruption, free and fair elections. And overlaid with that was really, again, this narrative that access to mobile phones, access to the internet, access to social media was going to really uplift these voices and actually help them break through the repression under which they were living and that they were rising up against. As part of my work, I was a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. I became responsible for Iran as a policy subject. But because traveling to Iran was virtually impossible, one of the first trips I took as a member of European Parliament in early 2010 was to Eastern Turkey, where at the time a lot of the activists from Iran had fled. They were all trying to escape because the crackdowns were serious. The prisons there are notorious for the most horrible things that can happen to people. And so here in Eastern Turkey, I was able to firsthand hear from people what they had gone through in these prisons, and also what they were experiencing as this movement against unfair elections and repressive governance in general was unfolding. And over again, when I would speak to human rights defenders in Iran, but also in other Middle Eastern countries later, they would tell me that their devices were being hacked and that their social media was being compromised, so that the authorities, when they were arrested or brought in for an interview, knew what they had been saying, knew who they had been in touch with. And frankly speaking, at times I thought, is this part of sort of the conspiracy and the fear that is actually quite common in the Middle East, right? A lot of suspicion with the authorities and a lot of gossip about what might happen. So I was shocked with what I heard, but I also just wanted to learn more about, what is going on here, because I wasn't aware of the details of what kind of tools, for example, these governments were using. So I dug into it and I found out, to my dismay, that this spyware and the hacking tools that the Islamic Republic's authorities, but also the Tunisian, the Egyptian, the Syrian authorities, all known for human rights violations, were exported to these countries from Europe. And this was at the time when our governments were saying, respect the rights of the people, give them free and fair elections, do not crack down on a free press, do not arrest peaceful protesters, and so on. The world was really quite united in the democratic world in actually supporting these movements and their rights. While in fact, the technologies that were helping the dictators stay in their seats were made in Europe, but also made in other democracies. So I saw this as a huge hypocrisy, and it was a wake-up call for me because I saw such a contrast between the narrative of what technology might bring in terms of all these great things and the reality on the ground. And so it became very clear to me early on in my mandate that if we wanted technology to be a force of good, we needed to make sure it would be, and not just trust the markets and hope that incredible effects would come of it, because it was not actually happening in practice, or there was a one-sided utopian view of what the technology would bring. So this is just a starting point of what shaped my view around the relationship between technology as it emerged, as it created new realities, as it became more forceful as a technology, a variety of technologies, but also as companies became more and more significant players, not only in our economies, but also on the global stage in the geopolitical sense. And fast forward a little bit, if we look from today back to the past 20 years or so, we see an unfortunate but steady decline in democracy around the world. So people living in democracies are shrinking, but also the ability, for example, I'm sitting in New York here where the United Nations is coming together this week for the General Assembly. The ability of the democracies of this world to win votes at the UN is diminishing. It's becoming harder and harder. And as we all know, in the US, but also in countries in Europe like the Netherlands that I know best, there are domestic attacks on democracy. Anti-democratic tendencies, proposals, politicians who may run in elections that are held freely and fairly, but who actually use their acquired position then to stifle the free press, to go after minorities, to curb women's rights, et cetera, et cetera. And so the whole idea that technology that has started to play an ever-growing role in our lives over the past 20 years would bring democracy just doesn't show if we look at what is happening to democracy worldwide. Now, you have already discussed disinformation as an important issue, which I think it is. Behind disinformation, and I hope that was also something that you were able to consider, are not only the messages that are sent and the question of whether they can be trusted, whether they're factual, but there's also the whole question of data. Data that is collected about us as citizens and internet users, and data that can be weaponized against us. So that's an issue with disinformation, but it's also an issue, unfortunately, I think a very challenging one in the US now, with the restrictions to the freedom to have an abortion if necessary, where women have been targeted with data, not so much personal data, but data about where they've been, including around abortion centers, for example. So sometimes we see that the hoovering up of so much data, which almost all these tech companies really do, leads to new realities, new contexts down the road. And that is especially true also for the training of AI. A lot of these big tech companies have just amassed enormous amounts of data, and they're now sort of repurposing that data as the fuel to train their AI models, which you've also discussed in one of the sessions, and they actually often discriminate, and that is bad for women, for minorities, and actually for all of us, because it means that these technologies are acting against the spirit of the law, against the law that's on the books in most democracies, but that there's also very few consequences. And one of the reasons why this power of tech companies has gotten so big and there are so few consequences is that there is a systemic lack of transparency into how these companies work with their algorithms, how they collect the data, the kinds of terms of use, so the sort of private contract that you engage in as a internet user when you sign up for a service allows the companies to change the terms of service later. So we see that now with popular apps like LinkedIn, for example, this sort of professional social media platform that is now also training their AI models with people's data. And so even if when people signed up 10, 15 years ago, they never said that's okay, they would have said it's okay for LinkedIn to change the terms of service later. I use this example to illustrate how a notion of consent, a notion of being okay with what a company is going to do, doesn't work when the terms can be changed later on, and when between each and every one of us individually and the company on the other side, there's such a power asymmetry. They work with top lawyers, top designers, top engineers to incentivize the kind of behavior that works best for them, but that does not necessarily work well for society. And there are, broadly speaking, too few guardrails, too few restrictions, too few methods of insight and oversight, so transparency and accountability, that make sure that these companies, just like pharmaceutical companies, just like food and drink companies, or car companies for that matter, chemical production, all of these consumer goods, things we use every day, are an important part of our society, but they are also subject to a whole bunch of checks, restrictions, and oversight mechanisms to make sure that we are not the laboratory within which big pharma is testing its new medicine, that can only be done in very restricted context, to make sure that food is consistently safe. And if it's not, that there are mechanisms to do something about it, that chemicals, which are actually quite dangerous oftentimes, are only used in the right doses, and that there's oversight, not so much from the company that says what we're doing is awesome, you can trust us, but independent processes that verify this. And so one of the things that we need to do, and I'll wrap there and be happy to answer your questions, is to normalize having such transparency and accountability for tech products too, so that democratically elected and accountable leaders and their institutions are in charge again in guiding the way in which they believe technology should play a role in our society, making sure that there are also guardrails against abuse of power by governments through technology. But in any case, that it's the democratic process and the rule of law that decides where technology fits in our society, where the limits are, instead of having companies decide what they see fit and what they believe is best for them, for their shareholders, for their profits, which is obviously a very different incentive than what is important for society writ large. And just so that I give the right impression about the Tech Coup, the book that I just wrote, it is a criticism of Silicon Valley, but it's at least as much a criticism of political leaders on both sides of the aisle for allowing this to happen. And so the good news is, because so little has been done, particularly in the United States, there are so many things, many of them common sense and simple, that can be done starting today to make the situation better. So I don't want you to feel defeated and hopeless. I hope that, especially after reading the book, you will feel confident about what the problem is, namely outsized power on the part of the tech companies that's hurting democracy and the rule of law, and trickle down to all kinds of demographies and people, including women. But that you also feel like, okay, great, we can go to work and do something, make this part of the political agenda. And if the US were to lead here with all of its important tech companies, the world will change for the better. The US leadership has been bad in this case, also in some other issues, but particularly here. And it would be a real help if more government interventions, checks and balances would be put in place, not only through regulation, also through investments, also through using the purchasing power of governments to create better standards, because governments are often one of, if not the biggest buyers of IT products. So they have a lot of leverage simply by creating better contracts, better conditions in the public interest. So I'll stop there. I'm turning to the Q&A. And thank you for sharing the links to the book. Thanks for the kind note also. The question that I see here is, what are we to do with this mess? Personally, locally, state, federally, and nationally? Well, personally, I've just briefly touched upon, but I think the main challenge is that there's just so much power asymmetry. So it's great if people individually make better privacy decisions or decide to not give their kids a mobile phone because they think it's dangerous, or they're just not going to be on social media to find news. But the bulk of the people are going to use these products because they're attractive, they're fun, they're often free, quote unquote. And so the easing into using these products is very, very soft. Getting out is harder. And I think regulation or standard setting by governments will actually have to steer on behalf of masses of people behavior in a different direction, rather than hoping that piece by piece by piece individually we can create a critical mass. Now, other than that, on the local, state, federal, and international level, there are interventions that can be done on each level, sort of depending on who is responsible for what. So I recently was talking to a journalist in the Netherlands when the book launched there about what local governments could do. And frankly, that is not my expertise. My expertise is more on the national and the international level. But when you think about what local governments decide on, they decide on which security cameras to put up in the streets. Are they made in China? What happens to the data? Do you want security cameras at all? And what could be the downsides? Do companies get to keep the data and train it for other purposes later? What happens when there is a problem with the data or abuse of power, let's say by police forces because of technology that's used? Very much local themes to discuss. There's an issue about wanting to adopt AI on every level of government. I think right now, as there was with other waves of digitization, governments feel like they should digitize or miss the boat. They should embrace AI or miss the boat. And having a critical assessment of why AI or maybe why not, under what conditions, from what company, with what transparency and what oversight is really important on each level of government. But another example that I also illustrate in the book, and that is quite pertinent in many parts of the US as well, is the granting of licenses for the development of data centers, including very large ones. So typically tech companies need servers that hold the data that sit in enormous buildings. We're talking about buildings that are a couple of soccer fields or football fields large, and that use electricity to cool the servers because they generate heat as they, process and store data. And given the uptake of AI and cloud computing, for example, but also Bitcoin and other tech developments, they need more server space and more data centers. And the process of getting licenses for these is spread between at least state level in the United States and local level, and sometimes in the Netherlands, national, provincial, and local level. And there, the local level, even if it is least empowered, again, part-time city councillors that have a full-time job and that then on their Tuesday evening sit in the city council to vote on whether a data center can be built, have enormous decision-making power there. And the problem is, and this is a bad faith issue, the tech companies are not showing their true identity when they're bidding for these contracts on land and electricity, and they're grossly underestimating, underrepresenting the use of electricity and water. And especially in states in the US where there's already drought problems, where families often have to ration their water use when there's drought. Having such plants, basically, data centers that use so much water is simply unwise. But it's often, again, a decision that is not made out in the open, and that is not made with all the information that could be available, because companies get away with lying, deceiving, and hiding their identity. So, just a couple of examples of what happens on the local level. And then similarly on the national level, there are issues about, are there rules around artificial intelligence, for example? Are the rules binding? Is there enough budget for enforcement? Can a candidate, let's take Kamala Harris, be encouraged to take a firm position when it comes to tech policy? She, as is Donald Trump, is being incentivized by billionaires in Silicon Valley to replace Alina Khan at the FTC, to give more space, less regulation and oversight to the big tech companies, mostly in the name of competing with China. That's a really strong argument in the United States. But I think for Kamala Harris, what she does with these billionaires that are dangling big campaign financing promises before her, if she would only commit to replacing some of these people, it's really almost a litmus test. And so she also needs to feel empowered to develop a strong tech policy agenda for the US to take more of a leadership position. And it can be based on existing law, better enforcement of non-discrimination law, better enforcement of data privacy and consumer rights law. But it may also need new steps. And if it's not possible on the federal level, then the state level is really fascinating. So let me go to the next question. Is the word innovation more powerful in the US than in Europe? Well, coincidentally, I actually wrote my column about this tension in the FT this week. So a very successful lobbying mantra that the tech companies have rolled out says regulation stifles innovation. I don't know if this is something that sounds familiar, but when I was a lawmaker for 10 years, I would hear it every time that there was even a hint of a legislative proposal. They would say, oh my gosh, no, stop. Europe will never innovate if you're going to go down this path, and regulation stifles innovation, so it's disastrous. And even until today, when there's talk about AI regulation, you will, without exception, hear people from the tech companies making the claim that regulation will stifle innovation. So the connotation of the word innovation in the US is different. It is something that is considered to be incredibly important. And I think it is important to have an innovative economy, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it is more important than having healthy rules around the use of technology. So, in the position of government, there have to be trade-offs and balancing between different interests. Innovation is important, but non-discrimination is also important. National security is important. Public health is important. And so I would like there to be more room to look specifically case by case of whether the need to innovate prevails or whether there are other issues more important. And that may mean, indeed, that innovation sometimes has to take a back seat to the protection of fundamental rights or things like that. So I think we have to be bold to say this, because I'm saying this now as if it is common sense, which I think it is. But in fact, in reality, it has become something of a radical thing to say, because this notion that regulation stifles innovation has become the norm. And so it's put politicians on the defensive. Oftentimes when there's like a proposal or something discussed around putting up guardrails, checks and balances to the tech sector, you will hear politicians proactively saying, it is not that I want to stifle innovation. No, that's not my goal. But so they really have to sort of justify why they're doing their jobs, because this innovation and essentially economic argument is so strong. And I think that's a through line in understanding why we are where we are. The economic incentives have been dominant. And they have gone at the expense of stronger democracy, to make a long story short. All right. I'm going to the next question. I'm reading them so everybody's on the same page. 2 questions, it seems. 1, many of our members, government among others, don't have enough content knowledge and also are beholden to others when making decisions. What realistically can change? Tech is moving faster than people to accept these changes. And then question number 2, what can we do to influence to make a difference? So this is a key question. You will often hear pushback that governments don't know enough about technology. In fact, hardly anyone in society knows enough about technology, and that therefore, you've guessed correctly, it is better to let the tech companies who know so much about technology decide what to do with it. I will argue that this is a false argument. In Congress, there are votes about healthcare, and hardly anyone in there is a doctor. There are votes about agriculture, while hardly anyone elected is a farmer. And so the whole idea that it's only allowed or legitimate to say something about a topic that you studied for or that you are an expert in is not how we do things in a democracy. You're a representative of your people, and you're perfectly capable of saying, well, I don't want my kids to be exposed to products about which we know hardly anything. Or I do not want to be in a hospital that overly relies on AI, even though we know that it makes mistakes. And therefore, as a patient, I may suffer from the mistakes that are made because there's such over-reliance on AI. That is a perfectly legitimate thing to say without knowing exactly how healthcare works and without knowing exactly how AI works. So I think one of the things that needs to happen is that this becomes a political debate. This is about values. This is about trade-offs and choices that we want to make. So similar to, let's say, road safety. To say, I want the maximum precautions against accidents in cars is a perfectly legitimate position to take without being capable of taking a car apart and putting it back together again. And so we need to find words and positions and framings around where we stand as individuals, as citizens, as consumers, and what we want to ask of our politicians, and do away with the notion that only experts are allowed to talk, because it's actually a mechanism of exclusion. It's the same kind of mechanism that would say only highly educated people get to vote. Well, that's just not how it works. So everybody has a right to stake out their position vis-a-vis technology. And we can help by creating that space, that dialogue where these trade-offs can be discussed. You know, I'm often asked, are you in favor or against regulation? It's impossible to say because regulation can lead to 1,000 things, but the discussion is still quite shallow in many ways. It's new, it's emerging. And so what would greatly help is to give words and examples to what these choices really are that are accessible to many, many people, and to invite them actually to participate in the debate instead of trying to exclude them. Next question. How can our media take a different position to have an impact? Well, that's a great question too. I'll give you an illustration of what happened to me in the context of promoting this book. I gave an interview and I challenged the very optimistic and sort of hyperbolic way in which AI has now been welcomed. And the journalist said, well, we in the media totally did the same thing. Like they've just been writing all these, you know, enormous stories about how AI is going to change climate change or stop climate change, cure cancer, create scientific breakthroughs, you know, enormous promises without in-depth substantiation, except that maybe the companies are promising this. I was just, you know, I'm in some discussion groups with people who were criticizing a discussion at the European Commission. European Commission is also now new and finding its way. And somebody had again said, AI helps Indian farmers be more efficient and create more crops. And then someone else in the group said, oh my goodness, I've been hearing this example for about 10 years. So we need to be bold enough to challenge things, even if we've heard them a gazillion times. So if people keep saying AI is phenomenal, we should also be the ones in the room who say, well, really? Like, where does that claim come from? And can we place ourselves in the shoes of people who may actually not benefit? Because there are always pluses and minuses to everything that's being done. And so being the one who wants to challenge the big promises, I think is a pretty sensible place to be. And it's not to be against technology. It's just about wanting technology to be safe and to be subject to the same kinds of independent checks and balances that everything else, pretty much everything else in our society is, for good reason. We've learned the hard way from the banking crisis, from food poisoning scandals, or from buildings that have collapsed, that if you don't have sufficient safeguards, things do not go well, because there will always be a company that wants to do things a little bit more cheaply or a little bit more easily, or that has just blindly trusted the construction company or what have you. And it needs to just be more on the don't trust, verify. And if that's how we're going to talk about technology, we'll actually make enormous progress. And media, of course, can be those critical assessors, those investigators of the claims that are being made. Next question. How important would be state laws about data privacy? Well, very important, especially in the absence of federal regulation. So what we're seeing in the US, I think, is a sort of lack of ability to move on the part of Congress, right? Deep divisions, nothing really finding majorities because nobody wants to help the other, unfortunately. And so assessing and actually quite potent kind of dynamic that moves to the state level, where we see data privacy steps being taken or steps being taken to protect minors, for example, or to have better oversight over artificial intelligence, for example. So I think this is great. The only potential downside is that there's a lot of fragmentation, and that until now, the majority of people do not benefit, because if one state does a great job, there are still 49 other states that don't. And so using good examples of states to try to make those the national law could be a good thing to get behind. And obviously, if it feels easier to convince the state level leadership to do something, that's often better than not doing something. So I think it can be a step in the right direction. Is it an ideal scenario? No, but we don't live in an ideal political climate these days. So maybe that's just what we are going to have to work with. The other space where there's a lot of fascinating activity and jurisprudence is, of course, the courts. Looking at the antitrust cases, it's really a dynamic space where some change can be expected, and where there will be trickle-down effects from one court case in the rest of the country, because companies may change their behavior because they don't want to be losing another court case, or we can just learn from a ruling what justices will interpret and what they will do, and that in and of itself can change behavior. But these are, again, not the ideal pathways. Next question. We have the example of the breakup of AT&T and the breakup of airline industry. Would you call these successes? Yes, if companies have become so big that they abuse their market power, I think breaking them up can be a remedy. But these processes are both very lengthy, and they are only successful in a handful of cases. And lastly, they are very reactive. So I'm a big believer in antitrust rules as a sort of pillar of open economies and free societies. It's good for innovation and protecting consumers. But the topic that I care about most is the harm to democracy. And I worry if we leave the defense of democracy too much in the hands of these economic tools that can really only respond to excesses in the market, and that drag out for 5 years, 7 years, and are then concluded with fines. So, okay, that may be some kind of justice, a company gets to pay a couple of $1 billion in fines, but the harm is often already done in the process. It's remarkable to me that AT&T, but also Microsoft, that was faced with a big antitrust case back in the day, remain incredibly large and incredibly powerful companies. So it may have corrected some wrong, but it has not prevented the hyperscaling and concentration of power over a lot of different functions, and certainly with a lot of data in the hands of so few players. Okay, I now see tons of questions, so I'm going to try to speed up a little bit. Sorry for taking longer with the answers. Given the absence of regulation in the US and the endemic problem of dark money and concentration of power in our system, what do you think the plausibility of a global regulatory body is? We are trying to advocate for AI literacy in the K-12 education, and state adoption has been slow, as well as implementation of a curriculum. The problem with the lack of regulatory action in the US and the global level are related. The US is a big, powerful player. If it comes to the table with nothing, without a credible position to condemn others, without a model that proactively says this is how we want to govern technology, it's harder to bring about global, or let's say coalitions of the willing types of international rules. So we still need the US to move. Then with regard to AI literacy in the education system, I think it's important. I think teaching kids is always important. Education is critical, but I appreciate why it's difficult. And I don't really know how to change that because I'm not familiar with what state and what might be done. But hopefully, maybe one path could be to have famous people do something to caution kids with regard to tech, like football players or singers or something like that. In the Netherlands, we now have schools that actually ban the use of cell phones in classes. And it's really helping kids focus, the atmosphere in the classroom. So stuff can be done. Next question. Very difficult for governments to offer salaries that compete with Silicon Valley. How can governments overcome that problem? They never really will. But I see a lot of students at Stanford, for example, that are great computer scientists that would love to serve the public, but that don't quite know where to go, not so much because of salaries, but because the compute, so the calculation power of computers and data also are most advanced in the private sector. So even if you're willing to take a pay cut, but all you want is to do the most cutting edge research or work on the most cutting edge problems, you will also end up in the private sector. So this is a problem, something that we've been working on at Stanford by calling for more public interest data and compute for academic researchers, not just computer scientists, but also social scientists and others, to be made available. There has been in the US some increasing of the salaries when it comes to AI experts in government through the executive order. I think that's a good step. Not everything should be about money, but you also don't want to be completely out of the game. But I think ultimately, by making ourselves as governments less dependent on commercial tech companies and by investing more, so not just regulating, but also investing more in public interest, public value-based technologies, would create a market, would create talent pipelines, and would actually make the government a very important player in creating alternatives for the big commercial companies. So there are many ways in which this equation can be changed, but it's not ideal where we are. Next question. What are the links between Silicon Valley innovators and autocratic political leadership? Well, I think there is a cohort of people in Silicon Valley and Washington that are very libertarian. And some of them will argue that through technology, you don't need government anymore. This is quite an extreme position, but not unheard of. So there are tech leaders and investors that believe that the technology and the technologists will lead to a better society. So government incompetent, corporate leaders innovative and able. And so they are better placed, according to this conviction, to determine what is, where we're going to go and actually to build the products. So not to govern the society, but to build the society, for lack of better terms. And of course, now this whole merging between venture capitalists and political leaders is on display. We have J.D. Vance, who enjoys a lot of support from the venture capitalists, who has said, for example, to European leaders, if you are going to regulate Elon Musk's platforms, the US will pull out of NATO. So I've said he's actually doubling as a lobbyist for X, for Elon Musk, which is it's a completely unheard of position to take. But it shows that there is such support for the likes of Musk, who in turn supports the Republican candidates with a lot of money and with leverage of his social media platform. So the niche of people who believe that this is a good path forward have found each other, and the gloves have come off. And I think it's really quite tricky. Also with people like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel now beginning the narrative that Kamala Harris will steal the election, so that if she wins, it can only have been through illegitimate means. That's a narrative that's already being stirred up. And it's obviously very dangerous. One, it's not true until proven, but so far, no evidence of this. And two, we've seen with the storming of the Capitol and with riots recently in the United Kingdom, people will act upon this information. So it is not just a kind of freedom of expression issue to just say these things, which is how Elon Musk would like to present what he's doing. It's a free world. We can say whatever we want. There's an agenda behind this, and people actually act upon these kinds of signals, these kinds of theories, and are sometimes also incentivized to, use violence or challenge these outcomes, and to the detriment of the faith in democracy and therefore all of us. Next question. AI is being sold the same way the web, social media, and all new tech have been sold. Why isn't there more skepticism about the value of this new tech? Well, actually, there is a lot of skepticism, but there's more focus on risk. So I would say that with AI, unlike the other waves of new technologies, there is a lot of focus on risk. There's also debate about what kind of risk, future risk, end of humanity, catastrophe as a result of AI, or more things that we've discussed today, the fact that it discriminates so much, the fact that it hallucinates, which is a nice word for saying lying. It comes up with non-substantiated claims, but presents them as facts. So there are already problems that we can't even call risks anymore because they're here now. And there are concerns about the future. So there is a focus on the part of governments on these risks. I just don't think that there's clarity on how to solve them. And the idea of risks is also embraced by companies because they say, we see the risks, and therefore we have teams dealing with it. So again, they're trying to say, if there's a problem, we can solve it. And that is a different approach. Whether the outcome is good or bad, I don't care. A different approach than saying these processes must be independent checks and balances by definition. So irrespective of whether we like the CEO or hate the CEO, whether we think the risk is big or small, this is just not how we want to operate. And I think that's the level where we need to bring this discussion that it's not against tech or AI, but this is just not how we run things in a democratic society. Next question. Our book group just read Autocracy. Yeah, Autocracy Inc. from Anne Applebaum. What do you think about how tech has enabled or abetted a divisive political climate promoted by foreign adversaries? Well, I think it's a big problem. It is a big problem, and we've been naive. We've been naive about the resilience of democracy. We've been naive about the tools that our opponents are willing to use. And we are kept in the dark about how easy it is to do this, because it's still, until today, very hard for researchers to understand which settings in the algorithm of Facebook or YouTube or what have you has led to people flocking a certain direction, or what kind of nefarious ways of having influence are sort of lurking in these business models. So some of them have become clear, like groups you may have heard about in Facebook. So there's obviously what we can see, which is what people post in public. But then still, it very much depends on, who your friends are, what the kinds of discussions are there. And it means for a regulator that there may be niches on these platforms that are incredibly hard to find. But the existence of groups and the way in which the business model incentivizes people of the same curiosity or hobby or political conviction to find each other has actually been very perverse in some cases. Because on the one hand, there were basically no limits to what kind of group. So people could form a group of, let me just take an example, Jew haters. Advertisers could click on wanting to advertise to this specific demography. So by slicing the population in a certain way and then incentivizing them to come together or selling ads against them are sort of the different angles of how these business models work that are less accessible for research or understanding, and the combination of it all still needs much more independent research. And I think, especially in America, but also in parts of Europe, people have forgotten recent history where, in communism, disinformation from the state was a hugely important tool. Under Nazism, the abuse of people's private data has led to genocide. So we cannot forget that we've been here before with maybe a different wave of new technologies and a slightly different historical context, but the risk of abuse of power by either the state or the companies, and sometimes the combination of them, is something that we've seen many times before. And so we must always be alert and mindful of how this can be done. And I think the naivety lies in the fact that social media was embraced as something cool and innovative, even though it was clear from the beginning that it would actually touch the information ecosystem, and information is power. So we could have anticipated how bad actors might be interested, and bad actors might be those who want to defraud you as a consumer, or bad actors might be foreign states who want to actually destroy the open societies that we live in. And polarization, fear, mistrust in the democratic process are all very important to achieve this agenda. And as you've probably discussed in your previous sessions, are alive and kicking. So it's a big problem.
Marietja, I'm going to direct you to the last couple questions on the thread,
Yes.
because a couple of people are asking questions at the end that are sort of along the line of how can AI be used for good? How can we use it to build social cohesion? How can we use it to build integration in stronger communities? And I think
Right.
since we've just got a few minutes left, maybe we'd
Yeah.
like to end on that note.
Thanks. It's a good question. I'm sorry I didn't, because I was going
That's all
chronologically.
right. There were a lot
I
of
lost.
questions. Yeah.
Yes. There are a lot of promising tools being developed to create more deliberative processes, also with the help of AI. Or, for example, I was talking to Maria Ressa yesterday, who is a Nobel Prize winner and journalist with Rappler in the Philippines, this, publication that has been persecuted, and she has herself been subject to lots of court cases. But she has gone through the journey of embracing social media because she thought it would be a force for democracy, and then seeing how the lies spread actually completely eroded the fabric of society and led to authoritarian leaders to be elected. And now she is developing with Rappler these kinds of tools that incentivize deliberative engagement. So also underneath media comments, because there was a question about media before, you know how often when there's an article, the comments below just become completely polarizing, and sometimes just a flow of cuss words and irrelevant sometimes also to the topic, right? So somebody may talk about, I don't know, floods in a certain state, and somebody else may say, well, we should worry about floods of immigrants. We shouldn't worry about floods of water. Like, that's the least of our concerns. So it becomes this very divisive and aggressive place. And first of all, there's, of course, editorial choice to either allow for every comment or to sort of restrict and curate those. But then there are tools that can help with creating pause, creating context, filtering out, we do want to keep these comments that are relevant to the article. We don't want to keep these irrelevant sports related comments that have nothing to do with the news article or what have you. So there are ways to do it. But ultimately, the business models of social media companies that are so data hungry, that use data to target people in the most sensitive ways that we don't even understand about ourselves, remain very important, whether there's AI used on top of that or not. And so we cannot sort of see AI separate from the ecosystem that remains, and that remains a very toxic pathway. Do you want to suggest the last question?
I'm not sure if you answered this one. AI and civic education and social cohesion, AI and social integration in our country. I mean, I hear what you're saying. It's dangerous. You made a very persuasive case. We need transparency. We need data privacy. We need regulation. We need to bring this conversation into the civic sphere. We can't let tech rule. I think these questions are of a group that have to do with, can we use technology to build better tools?
It's definitely possible, but we have to be careful that we're also not going to then rely on those same companies that are through the front door creating the polarization and hyping up this AI, and through the back door saying, but oh, if you're worried about polarization, we have a tool for you. So it depends on the details. Everything is possible. We can build better public interest, democracy enhancing tools, but it has to be very deliberate. And there have to be processes in place that protect each and every one from their worst instincts. And I think that that's something that often doesn't happen. Is it impossible? No.
Yeah. All right, we're running up against the hour, and I think maybe we'll call it at this time. I want to just thank you so much, Marietja. The comments in the chat were so appreciative of the time you gave us and of the conversation that we had. We may all be a little more scared than we were when we started, but we're also probably a little more motivated to get to work. So thank you for joining us and for giving us so much to consider. Marietje has permitted us to record the conversation, and we'll post that to the League's website, hopefully tomorrow, and I'll send it around to people who signed up so that they can share it with others if they want to. You can also see recordings of some of our earlier speakers on the League of Women Voters of Maine's website, and feel free to share any or all of those. If you'd like to help us keep this series going, it doesn't cost much, but it does cost a little. We have some staff support. Please consider a small donation to our tip jar on the League of Women Voters of Maine's website. You can put digital democracy in the how should this donation be used box. We're taking October off, but we'll probably be back in November. So watch for details and let your friends know once the information about that session is posted. We hope to see you here in November, and it'll be after the election, so we'll probably have a lot to talk about. Thank you again so much, Marietja, and thank you all
You're
for
very
joining us.
welcome. And we'll be following all your work and what the US does in November with incredible interest around the world. So keep up the good work. Bring in as many women as you can to vote. I'm sure you're going to make a big difference. And I know this work is sometimes an uphill battle, but it is more relevant than ever.
Thanks again. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.